October 7, 1944. The transport ship lurched through gray Atlantic waters, and Corporal Heinrich Müller pressed his palm against the cold metal bulkhead, feeling the vibration travel through shattered bone and torn muscle. 23 years old. Left leg mangled below the knee where the Sherman tank shell had found him in the wheat fields outside Cannes. The morphine had worn off hours ago, replaced by a grinding throb that pulsed with each swell of the ocean. Around him in the converted cargo hold, 200 German prisoners lay on stretchers, sat hunched on wooden benches, or stood gripping overhead pipes. Men who 3 months earlier had believed they were defending civilization itself against mongrel hordes. Now they were crossing an ocean to face what Nazi propaganda had promised would be worse than death: captivity in the decadent, Jew-controlled United States of America. Heinrich had believed every word. He remembered the Wochenschau newsreels in the cinema back in Stuttgart, before the war consumed everything. Images of bread lines in American cities, gangsters with machine guns, Negroes living in filth, a nation so weak, so morally corrupted, that it could barely feed its own people, let alone pose a threat to the 1,000-year Reich. His Hitler Youth leader had shown them photographs, or what he claimed were photographs, of American POW camps. Skeletal men behind barbed wire, guards with whips, bodies stacked like cordwood. 3 days ago, when the American medics had lifted him onto the ship at Southampton, Heinrich had tried to memorize their faces. "Know your executioners," he thought. The black soldier who'd carried his stretcher had been gentle, almost apologetic when Heinrich winced. This confused him. The Jewish doctor who'd examined his wound had checked his pulse, looked into his eyes, made notes on a clipboard without speaking. Heinrich waited for the cruelty to begin. It hadn't. Not yet. Now, as the ship pitched and hundreds of men groaned in a symphony of nausea and pain, Heinrich heard someone vomiting nearby, the smell of diesel fuel mixed with human waste and disinfectant. An American sailor walked through, distributing paper bags for seasickness. He couldn't have been older than 19, this boy with red hair and freckles, and he moved with practiced efficiency, handing bags to Germans and Americans alike, making no distinction. Heinrich watched him help an SS officer who'd fouled himself, watched the young American show no disgust, no triumph, just tired professionalism. The first crack in certainty is always small. To understand what happened to Heinrich Müller and more than 375,000 German prisoners of war who passed through American camps between 1943 and 1946, you must first understand what they expected. You must grasp the architecture of belief that Nazi propaganda had constructed in their minds, a cathedral of lies so vast, so internally consistent, that reality itself would need to dismantle it brick by brick. The Third Reich's Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, under Joseph Goebbels, had spent 12 years crafting an image of the United States as a civilization in terminal decline. This wasn't mere wartime propaganda. It was a comprehensive worldview, taught in schools, reinforced in newspapers, hammered home in radio broadcasts and newsreels. America, Germans were told, was a nation of racial chaos, where inferior peoples had corrupted the few remaining drops of Nordic blood. It was a place where Jewish financiers controlled everything, where workers starved while capitalists gorged themselves, where crime flourished and morality had died. German soldiers carried this certainty into battle. When they surrendered, if they surrendered, many expected immediate execution. Those who anticipated survival imagined slow death through starvation and forced labor. The luckiest, they thought, might endure a few years of misery before being released to a destroyed fatherland. What they found instead would break their understanding of the world so completely that 3/4 of them, 75%, documented in repatriation surveys conducted by both American military authorities and independent observers, would leave the United States with what official reports carefully termed gratitude and friendly feelings toward their captors. This is the story of that transformation. It begins with blood. Heinrich Müller's wound had happened fast, the way death usually does in war. His panzer unit had been retreating through Normandy hedgerows, playing a hopeless game of delay against forces that seemed to materialize from nowhere with infinite ammunition and absolute air superiority. On July 19, 1944, his tank took a direct hit from a Sherman at 400 meters. He remembered the sound, a metallic shriek, followed by pressure that turned the world white. Then he was outside somehow, crawling through mud, his left leg bent at an angle that made no anatomical sense. The pain came later. First came shock, the body's mercy. German medics reached him within minutes, but they had no morphine left, no proper bandages. One of them, a veteran named Klaus with kind eyes and hands that wouldn't stop shaking, tied a tourniquet using a leather belt and told Heinrich he'd probably lose the leg if he didn't die first. The Americans captured their position 6 hours later. Heinrich had prepared himself for execution. He'd heard stories, hadn't everyone, of Americans shooting prisoners, especially SS men, especially anyone who'd fought hard. He wasn't SS, just Wehrmacht, just a boy from Stuttgart who'd believed in something larger than himself, and now bled into French soil for it. When the American soldiers approached, Heinrich closed his eyes. Someone cut the tourniquet. Jesus Christ, this kid's gonna lose his leg. Medic! Medic! Heinrich understood no English then, but he understood urgency, understood the tone of concern. 2 American soldiers lifted him onto a stretcher, lifted him, didn't drag him, and ran with him to a field hospital that appeared to be made entirely of canvas and miracles. A surgeon, in a blood-stained apron, examined the wound for perhaps 30 seconds. Before shouting orders, Heinrich couldn't pass. They gave him ether. They operated within 20 minutes of his capture. When Heinrich woke, his leg was still attached. This moment, this impossible reversal of everything Heinrich had been taught to expect, was replicated thousands of times daily across the European theater and later in camps across the American homeland. It was the first shock, the initial crack in the Nazi worldview. But it was far from the last. At the field hospital in Normandy, Heinrich spent 3 weeks recovering before being transported to a larger facility in England. During that time, he observed, the American doctors treated German wounded with the same speed and skill they used on their own men. Sometimes better. American wounded had to wait for available beds, but the Germans were evacuated first to make room. This made no sense to Heinrich. Where was the racial hierarchy? Where was the contempt that a superior people should show the inferior? A black nurse changed his bandages every day. Heinrich had never spoken to a black person before. Nazi propaganda had taught him they were barely human, closer to apes, incapable of civilization or complex thought. This woman, her name tag read Lo Bach Johnson, spoke flawless English, worked with surgical precision, and once, when Heinrich whimpered in pain as she cleaned his wound, she paused and said something soft he couldn't understand, but recognized as kindness. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Heinrich began keeping a mental ledger of impossibilities. American doctors who saved German lives before American ones. Sufficient food even for prisoners. Medicine that actually worked. Guards who didn't beat you. The absence of torture. The absence of systematic cruelty. Each observation was a small detonation in the architecture of his beliefs. By the time he boarded the ship for America, Heinrich Müller was no longer certain of anything except pain and confusion. The crossing took 11 days. The ship, a converted Liberty cargo vessel, named the SS George Washington, carried 2,400 German prisoners, guarded by 300 American soldiers. In the propaganda Heinrich had absorbed since childhood, this ratio would have been impossible. Surely the prisoners would overwhelm their captors, seize the ship, sail back to Europe to fight another day. But no one tried. The prisoners were too broken, too uncertain, too fundamentally confused by their treatment to organize resistance. More than that, many were beginning to question whether resistance served any purpose. In the hold, Heinrich met other prisoners who shared his disorientation. There was Otto, a tank commander from Hamburg, who'd been captured in the Ardennes. Karl, an infantryman from Munich who'd surrendered with his entire company when they ran out of ammunition and their officers fled. Friedrich, a former Hitler youth leader who still wore his uniform with pride, but whose eyes had gone hollow with doubt. They spoke in whispers, afraid of informers, though later they would learn that American camp authorities cared little about what prisoners said unless they were planning escape or violence. They compared notes on their treatment, searching for the trick, the hidden cruelty, the moment when American benevolence would crack and reveal the savagery beneath. "They gave me a chocolate bar," Otto said one night, his voice thick with suspicion. "Real chocolate, not ersatz." "Why?" "Fattening us up," Friedrich suggested. "Make us weak. Or," Karl said slowly, dangerously, "maybe chocolate isn't as scarce in America as we were told." This thought hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. If they had been lied to about chocolate, about something so small, so verifiable, what else was false? The ship docked in Norfolk, Virginia, on October 18th, 1944. Heinrich Müller, leaning on crutches fashioned by an American carpenter, stepped onto American soil, expecting a wasteland of poverty and chaos. He saw instead a forest of cranes offloading cargo, warehouses that stretched further than he could see. Trucks, dozens, hundreds of trucks, moving in organized convection, each one newer and better maintained than any vehicle he'd seen in Germany since 1941. American dock workers, both white and black, operating machinery with casual competence. No one looked starving. No one looked desperate. The second crack in certainty is when you realize your eyes have been lying to you all along, or rather, when you realize others have been lying about what your eyes should see. Camp Butner, North Carolina, would be Heinrich Müller's home for the next 2 years and 3 months. It was one of 511 prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the United States from Texas to Montana to Maine. Together, these camps would house more than 425,000 German prisoners by war's end, men who would receive an education in democracy they could not have imagined in their darkest surrendering moments. The camp sat on 62 acres of pine forest, surrounded by double barbed wire fences and guard towers that Heinrich noted were sparsely manned. The barracks were wooden, winterized, heated. Each housed 50 men in bunks that had mattresses, actual mattresses, not straw, and blankets. There was running water. There were flush toilets. There was a medical clinic staffed by both American doctors and German POW physicians. There was a library. There was a theater. There was a canteen where prisoners could purchase cigarettes, candy, and toiletries using scrip earned from labor. Heinrich's first meal in the mess hall destroyed another pillar of his worldview. Boiled potatoes, beef stew with actual beef, bread, white bread, soft and fresh, canned vegetables, coffee with sugar. Portions were measured by American Army regulations, 3,000 calories per day for prisoners not performing hard labor, 4,000 for those who did. This was more than most German civilians had eaten since 1942. It was roughly equivalent to what American soldiers ate. He sat at a long table with Otto, Karl, and Friedrich, staring at his tray. "This is a trap," Friedrich said, but his voice carried no conviction. He was already eating. "Maybe," Otto replied around a mouthful of beef. "But I'm too hungry to care." Heinrich ate slowly, methodically, waiting for his stomach to rebel against food it had forgotten existed. Instead, he felt strength returning to muscles that had grown hollow with deprivation. He felt his mind clearing, fog lifting. He realized, with a start that made him drop his fork, that he'd been malnourished for years without knowing it, that the gnawing emptiness he'd learned to ignore wasn't normal, that German rations, decreasing since 1942, barely sufficient since 1943, had been slowly killing him, even as propaganda posters proclaimed guns before butter and promised that sacrifice today meant victory tomorrow. But here, in captivity, in the land of his enemies, he ate better than he had in freedom. The re-education program began, slowly, almost imperceptibly. American camp authorities, working with a carefully selected group of anti-Nazi German intellectuals, understood that direct ideological assault would only strengthen resistance. Instead, they created an environment where prisoners could reach conclusions themselves, where the contradictions between propaganda and reality would grind against each other until something broke. They started with cinema. Twice weekly, prisoners were required to attend screenings in the camp theater. At first, Heinrich and others resisted, sitting in hostile silence while American propaganda flickered on screen. They expected crude anti-German films, demonization, lies. What they got instead was something more dangerous. Truth, presented without editorial comment. The first screening Heinrich attended showed documentary footage of liberated concentration camps. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, mountains of skeletal corpses, living humans who looked like animated skeletons, mass graves, gas chambers, crematoria. American soldiers with handkerchiefs over their faces, vomiting as they walked through hell. The camp commander provided no commentary. The film simply played, 52 minutes of footage shot by U.S. Army Signal Corps photographers who'd been ordered to document everything for history. When the lights came up, the theater sat in absolute silence. Heinrich felt something cold expanding in his chest, pushing against his ribs, making it hard to breathe. Around him, men wept. Others sat stone-faced. A few shouted that it was fake. Hollywood tricks, Jewish propaganda. But Heinrich had seen enough propaganda to recognize its absence. This footage had the texture of reality. The awkward camera movements, the unscripted chaos, the faces of American soldiers showing genuine horror. This wasn't staged. This couldn't be staged. They're lying, Friedrich said later, back in the barracks. But he said it like a question. What if they're not? Karl asked. That night, Heinrich couldn't sleep. He thought about the camps, about orders he'd heard whispered, about Jews and Poles and Russians who'd simply disappeared from occupied territories, about things he'd chosen not to know, not to question, because questioning meant doubting, and doubt was treason. He thought about his leg, saved by American surgeons who'd treated him like a human being worth saving. He thought about the food in his stomach, the warmth of the barracks, the absence of cruelty. He thought about the newsreels back home that had shown him starving Americans and told him they were subhuman. Somewhere in that sleepless night, Heinrich Müller began to understand that he'd been lied to about everything that mattered. The transformation didn't happen to everyone. Camp Butner held approximately 5,000 prisoners at peak capacity, and among them were men who would never renounce National Socialism. Die-hard Nazis, mostly SS, who organized secret cells, enforced ideological purity through intimidation, and punished those who cooperated with Americans. They beat German prisoners who attended English classes. They threatened anyone who spoke positively about camp conditions. They maintained their faith in Hitler, even after Germany's surrender, even after being shown irrefutable evidence of the Holocaust, even after years in American captivity. But they were the minority. Most prisoners, confronted daily with evidence that contradicted everything they'd been taught, began the painful process of ideological reformation. It wasn't quick. It wasn't easy. Belief systems don't collapse under single blows. They erode, grain by grain, until the foundation can no longer support the structure. For Heinrich, the erosion accelerated when he joined a work detail. Prisoners at Camp Butner could volunteer for labor assignments at local farms, factories, and military installations. They were paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, currency that could be exchanged for real dollars upon repatriation. The Geneva Convention prohibited forced labor on war-related production, so prisoners mostly worked agricultural jobs, harvesting tobacco, picking cotton, processing peanuts, maintaining equipment. Heinrich, his leg healed enough for light duty, joined a crew assigned to a farm 15 miles from camp. They rode there in the back of a truck, guarded by 2 American soldiers who seemed more bored than vigilant. The farmer, a man named Jack Morrison with sun-weathered skin and hands like leather, greeted them without hostility. "Y'all work hard. I'll treat you fair," Morrison said through a translator. "Slack off, and you're back to camp. We clear?" They were clear. Heinrich spent 6 months working that farm, and it completed his education in American reality. He saw Morrison's house, modest by American standards, palatial by German ones, indoor plumbing, electricity, a radio, a refrigerator, a car that Morrison drove daily, burning gasoline that Germans hadn't seen in years except in military vehicles. Morrison's wife packed lunches for the prisoners that included sandwiches with real meat, apples, sometimes pie. Their teenage son wore shoes without holes. This wasn't wealth. This was normal. This was how ordinary Americans lived. The farm itself was a revelation. Mechanization, Heinrich had only imagined. A John Deere tractor that could plow more in an hour than 10 men with horses could do in a day. Hybrid seeds that produced yields German farmers would have called miraculous. Chemical fertilizers, pesticides, modern irrigation. American agricultural productivity was so overwhelming that the government paid farmers to produce less, to avoid flooding markets with surplus. Surplus. Heinrich turned the word over in his mind like a foreign coin. Germany had known no surplus since he was a child. Germany had known requisition, rationing, shortage, deprivation. But surplus? Abundance so great that destruction was necessary to prevent collapse. He asked Morrison one day through the translator why America had so much. Morrison considered the question, chewing tobacco, then shrugged. "Free enterprise. I reckon. Government stays mostly out of the way, lets folks figure things out. You work hard, you get ahead. You come up with a better way to do something, you profit. Simple as that." This was economic theory. Heinrich had been taught to dismiss as Jewish capitalism, as the exploitation of workers by plutocrats. But he could see no plutocrats here. Just Morrison, who worked alongside his laborers, who ate the same lunch, who got dirty in the same soil. Just a system that had somehow created more prosperity than Heinrich had thought possible. By spring of 1945, Camp Butner had established a comprehensive re-education program that went far beyond mandatory film screenings. American authorities had recruited anti-Nazi German intellectuals, refugees who'd fled the Third Reich, academics who'd opposed Hitler from the beginning, to teach courses in democratic theory, constitutional government, and free market economics. These courses were voluntary, but more than 5,000 prisoners across all American camps enrolled. Heinrich attended every class available. He studied English with desperate intensity, moving from basic vocabulary to reading newspapers within 6 months. He devoured books from the camp library. American history, political philosophy, economics, literature. He read the Federalist Papers, Lincoln's speeches, the Constitution itself. He read Tocqueville's Democracy in America and found it describing a system that actually seemed to function in the country around him. The reading room in the camp library became his sanctuary. 20 wooden tables, 100 chairs, shelves holding 5,000 volumes donated by American civic organizations. Light streaming through tall windows. The smell of old paper and possibility. Heinrich would sit for hours, his injured legs stretched out, working through texts that reconfigured his understanding of how humans could organize themselves. Democracy, he'd been taught, was mob rule, chaos where the inferior, many oppressed the superior few. But the American system was more complex than that. Checks and balances, separation of powers, constitutional rights that even majorities couldn't revoke. A system designed to prevent tyranny while enabling collective decision-making. It wasn't perfect. Heinrich read about slavery's long shadow, about Jim Crow laws that denied black Americans the rights white citizens enjoyed. But he also read about abolition, about the Civil War, fought to end slavery, about ongoing struggles for equality. He read about a system that could criticize itself, reform itself, correct its own errors without requiring revolution. This was the difference he began to understand. Germany had built a system where criticism was treason, where reform was impossible, where error could only compound because admitting error was weakness. America had built a system where criticism was patriotic, where reform was expected, where error could be acknowledged and addressed. The system that couldn't question itself had led to Buchenwald. The system that could question itself had led to abundance. On November the 28th, 1944, a remarkable event occurred at Camp Butner that would be documented in military records and later studied by historians as evidence of the re-education program's psychological impact. After a particularly graphic screening of footage from newly liberated Auschwitz-Birkenau, approximately 1,000 German prisoners, nearly 20% of the camp's population, gathered spontaneously in the main yard. Heinrich was among them. He stood in cold November rain, watching as men he'd lived beside for months began removing their Wehrmacht uniforms. Not all of them, not the outer garments in that weather, but insignia, medals, rank markers, symbols of service to a regime they could no longer defend. Someone produced a barrel, someone else brought matches. The burning started slowly, almost tentatively. One man tossed in his iron cross, another added collar insignia. Then more and more, until 100 men were throwing military decorations into flames that hissed in the rain. Officers' pips, campaign medals, belt buckles embossed with Gott mit uns, God with us, a phrase that now seemed like the cruelest joke history had ever told. Friedrich stood apart from the crowd, his face twisted with contempt and something that might have been grief. Otto and Karl stood beside Heinrich, watching fire consume symbols they'd once been proud to wear. "We were fools," Otto said quietly. "We were children," Karl replied. "They made us fools." Heinrich said nothing. He'd given his decorations to the fire earlier, watching them blacken and curl. He felt no catharsis, no relief, just a hollowness where certainty used to live. Just the terrible responsibility of knowing that everything he'd fought for, everything his friends had died for, had been service to a machine of industrial murder. Camp authorities let the burning continue without interference. They photographed it, documented it, would later present it as evidence of successful re-education. But Heinrich wondered if they understood that what they were witnessing wasn't conversion so much as collapse. The structure of Nazi ideology hadn't been defeated by American arguments. It had been crushed under the weight of American reality. You can't argue with abundance. You can't propagandize against medical care that saves your life. You can't maintain racial hierarchy when the people you were taught to despise treat you with dignity. You can't believe in your superiors' wisdom when they've led you into catastrophe, while the enemies you were taught to despise live in prosperity. The fire burned for 3 hours, fed by the remnants of belief. As 1945 became 1946, and Germany's unconditional surrender turned into occupation, The transformation of German prisoners of war in America accelerated. News from home painted a picture of devastation that American newsreels hadn't exaggerated. Cities reduced to rubble, millions dead or displaced, an economy that had ceased functioning, starvation spreading across the Soviet occupation zone. The entire nation, prostrate, defeated, occupied, judged. Prisoners at Camp Butner followed these developments through newspapers, magazines, and letters from home that began arriving in spring of 1945. Heinrich received his first letter in April from his mother, who'd survived Stuttgart's bombing but lived now in a basement apartment with 2 other families. She wrote about hunger, about cold, about occupation soldiers, about survival. She asked if he was alive. She said she loved him. She said she forgave him for fighting. She said she didn't understand what the war had been for. Heinrich read the letter 20 times, memorizing each word. Then, he sat down at a table in the recreation hall and wrote back, in English first as practice, then translating carefully into German. Mutti, I am alive, I am well, I am in North Carolina, America, in a prison camp that is better than home was at the end. I have my leg. Americans saved it. I eat every day. I am warm. I am learning. Mutti. I think we were lied to. About everything. I am ashamed of what I fought for. But I am learning how to be something else. I don't know what yet. But something else. I love you. Heinrich. He never received a response. The letter either never arrived or his mother chose not to answer. Heinrich would never know which, though both possibilities haunted him. The re-education program intensified in the final year of captivity. American authorities understood that these prisoners would return to occupied Germany, where they could become either assets for democratic reconstruction or bitter obstacles to reform. Everything depended on what they'd learned, what they'd seen, what they'd become in America. Advanced courses covered civics, constitutional law, and economics. German intellectuals lectured on the failures of Weimar, the rise of fascism, the conditions that had made Hitler possible. American professors taught about federalism, local governance, civil society, free press. Prisoners practiced mock elections, debated policy, wrote essays on democratic principles. More than 25,000 prisoners across all American camps participated in these intensive educational programs. Heinrich was among the most dedicated students. He filled 3 notebooks with lecture notes, vocabulary lists, political analysis. He wrote a 40-page essay on the differences between American and German governmental structure, analyzing how the Weimar Constitution's weaknesses had enabled dictatorship. His instructor, Professor David Haber, a Jewish refugee from Berlin who'd lost his entire family in the Holocaust, gave him an A and wrote in the margin, "You understand. Now help others understand." This commission, to carry understanding home, would shape the rest of Heinrich's life. But understanding came with costs. Many prisoners who embraced democracy found themselves ostracized by hardline Nazis who still controlled large sections of camp social structure. Violence occasionally erupted. In one incident at another camp, anti-Nazi prisoners were beaten severely enough to require hospitalization. American authorities responded by segregating the worst Nazi elements, creating special compounds for the unreconstructible. Heinrich avoided the violence by keeping his transformations private, at least initially. But by early 1946, as repatriation approached, he'd become bold enough to speak openly. He attended a camp meeting where prisoners debated Germany's future, when an SS officer declared that National Socialism would rise again, that the Jewish conspiracy would be exposed, that Germany would be reborn in purity and strength. Heinrich stood. His voice shook, but he spoke clearly. "We lost because we deserved to lose. We followed evil. We believed lies. We killed millions for a madman's dreams. And now we have a chance, maybe the only chance, to build something better. If we go home believing the old lies, we'll build the same nightmare. If we go home with what we've learned here, we can build something worth living for." The SS officer called him a traitor. Half the room jeered. But the other half, men like Otto and Karl, men who'd worked American farms and attended American classes and eaten American food and received American medical care, sat in thoughtful silence. Some nodded, a few applauded. The vote was turning. Repatriation began in earnest in spring of 1946. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war were to be returned as quickly as possible after hostilities ended. But the process took time. Logistics, politics, and occupation arrangements slowed everything. Prisoners left in groups, transported first to ports, then loaded onto ships for the crossing back to a Germany they barely recognized. Heinrich Müller left Camp Butner on May 12, 1946, with 197 other prisoners. He'd spent 2 years and 7 months in American captivity. He walked with a slight limp. His left leg had healed, but not perfectly. He carried a duffel bag containing extra clothes, 3 notebooks full of writing, 12 books from the camp library that Americans let him keep, and $247.60. His labor wages, converted from camp script to real American currency at a rate of 80 cents per day of work. $247, more money than Heinrich had ever possessed, enough to live on for months in occupied Germany, enough to start something. At the camp gate, American guards shook hands with departing prisoners. The gesture startled Heinrich. Enemy soldiers, treating him as an equal, wishing him well. One guard, a sergeant from Iowa, named Thompson, who'd overseen Heinrich's work detail, pulled him aside. "You learned good English, Müller," Thompson said. "You gonna use it to build something good back home?" "I will try," Heinrich replied. "That's all any of us can do. Try. Good luck." They shook hands. Thompson's grip was firm, respectful. Heinrich felt something crack inside him. Not breaking, but opening, like a fist finally relaxing after years clenched tight. The journey home took 3 weeks. The ship was crowded, but orderly. Prisoners talked endlessly about what they'd seen, what they'd learned, what they'd become. Some remained bitter, some were confused, but most, like Heinrich, carried a new understanding. That democracy wasn't weakness, that prosperity wasn't shameful, that treating humans with dignity wasn't foolishness, but strength. Official surveys conducted during repatriation by both American military officials and independent observers documented this transformation with precision. In interviews given just before prisoners boarded ships, 3/4 reported gratitude and friendly feelings toward their captors. 75% of men who'd arrived expecting death and found instead an education in everything their government had taught them to despise. This percentage would become one of the most significant statistics in the history of prisoner of war treatment, studied by historians and military planners for decades. It represented not just successful propaganda, but genuine ideological transformation, achieved through the most powerful argument possible, demonstrated alternative reality. Heinrich Müller arrived in Bremen on June 4, 1946. The port was a wasteland of twisted metal and shattered concrete. American occupation forces had cleared shipping lanes, but the city itself was barely recognizable. 90% destroyed by bombing, its population reduced by half through death and displacement. He took a train south toward Stuttgart, though rail service was spotty and slow. The journey revealed devastation beyond anything Heinrich had imagined. Every city damaged or destroyed, bridges blown, factories gutted, civilians hollow-eyed and desperate, women and children digging through rubble for anything salvageable, old men pulling carts because there were no horses left, the smell of death and ashes. This was what losing looked like. This was what following Hitler had achieved. But Heinrich also saw American occupation forces distributing food, medical teams treating civilians, engineers rebuilding infrastructure, evidence of the Marshall Plan already beginning, American money and resources flowing into former enemy territory to prevent starvation and enable reconstruction. Even in defeat, even in occupation, Germany was receiving more help from America than it had given its own people during victory. Stuttgart was worse than Bremen. Heinrich found his mother's building, half collapsed but inhabitable on the lower floors. She was there, aged 20 years in 3. They held each other and wept. She fed him watery soup, made from American ration packages. He gave her $100, keeping the rest for what he was beginning to plan. Over the next weeks, Heinrich reconnected with other returning prisoners of war. Many shared his experiences. They'd seen America. They'd learned English. They'd studied democracy and economics and constitutional law. They'd witnessed functioning civil society, abundant production, racial complexity, and institutional stability. They'd been treated well by people they'd been taught to consider enemies. Now they were home in ruins, and they understood that rebuilding would require abandoning everything that had led to destruction. What happened next unfolded over years and became one of the great success stories of post-war reconstruction, though its full impact remained partially hidden from historical narrative. Former prisoners of war became carriers of American ideals into West German society. They entered business, politics, education, media, and civil service with knowledge of how democratic systems functioned, how free markets operated, and how prosperity could be achieved through institutions rather than conquest. Approximately 5,000 former prisoners eventually immigrated permanently to the United States. Heinrich would be among them, arriving in New York in 1952 with his new wife, a German teacher named Anna, who shared his vision of starting fresh. Thousands more returned as tourists, business partners, and exchange participants, maintaining transatlantic connections that helped shape West Germany's pro-American orientation during the Cold War. But even those who never left Germany carried American influence. They introduced American agricultural techniques to German farms, increasing productivity by factors that economists documented in occupation records. They brought American business methods to German industry, contributing to the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle that transformed West Germany from wasteland to powerhouse within 15 years. They promoted democratic values in politics and education, helping create the stable, liberal democracy that West Germany became. Heinrich's contribution was small, but real. He used his remaining money to open an agricultural supply business in Stuttgart, importing American equipment and teaching German farmers modern techniques he'd learned at Morrison's farm. The business succeeded modestly. He employed 7 people. He paid fair wages. He treated workers with dignity. He voted in every election. He spoke at schools about democracy, about the dangers of totalitarianism, about the importance of questioning authority. He never forgot that his life had been saved by American surgeons who treated an enemy soldier like a human being worth saving. He never forgot eating better as a prisoner than he had as a free German. He never forgot libraries and theaters and education, offered to men who'd fought against everything America represented. He never forgot guards who didn't beat him, officers who treated him fairly, and farmers who shared their lunch. This was the paradox that broke Nazi ideology. Kindness from those who had every right to cruelty. Abundance shared with those who'd sought to destroy its source. Dignity extended to those who'd served a regime that denied dignity to millions. You cannot maintain belief in your enemy's inferiority when those enemies save your life and treat you better than your own leaders did. You cannot sustain propaganda about weakness when surrounded by evidence of overwhelming strength. You cannot believe lies about poverty when witnessing surplus beyond imagination. Reality, deployed systematically and with patience, proved more powerful than any ideology. Heinrich Müller died in Stuttgart on March 19, 1998 at age 77. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his business success, his family, 3 children, 7 grandchildren, and his decades of civic engagement. It mentioned that he was a prisoner of war in America during World War II, learning English and American agricultural methods. It didn't mention the transformation. How could it? How do you compress into newsprint the earthquake in the soul when everything you believed collapses and you must build new understanding from ruins? How do you explain the gratitude of a man who left his enemy's country with money in his pocket, knowledge in his mind, and hope in his heart, where there had been only despair? The historical record documents this transformation imperfectly but persistently. Repatriation surveys, camp records, prisoner testimonies, immigration data, occupation authorities' reports on the influence of returned POWs, academic studies of Germany's democratic reconstruction, economic analyses of the Marshall Plan's success, political histories of West Germany's pro-Western orientation. Numbers tell part of the story. 375,000 German prisoners in American camps. 25,000 enrolled in intensive re-education programs. 75% reporting gratitude at repatriation. 5,000 eventually immigrating to America. Countless others maintaining business and cultural connections. But numbers can't capture the weight of the transformation. The personal cost of abandoning belief. The courage required to admit you fought for evil. The strength needed to learn from enemies. The humility necessary to accept that you were wrong about everything that mattered. Heinrich kept a journal during his last years. His children found it after his death. 3 notebooks full of English and German, observations and memories, attempts to make sense of what his life had meant. One entry, dated November the 28th, 1995, 51 years exactly after the burning at Camp Butner, read, "I surrendered twice, first in France when Americans captured me and saved my leg, second in America when reality captured me and saved my soul. Both surrenders were gifts. Both required Americans to show mercy they didn't owe. I spent my life trying to deserve that mercy. I don't know if I succeeded. But I tried." Thompson said that's all any of us can do. Try. I hope it was enough. The notebook also contained calculations, an old man's attempt to quantify grace. 2 years and 7 months at Camp Butner multiplied by 3 meals per day equals 2,887 meals. Each meal better than what German civilians ate during the war. Each meal an argument against Nazi propaganda. Each meal a small demonstration that enemies can choose kindness. 2,887 arguments, multiplied by 375,000 prisoners, multiplied by the number of Germans each prisoner influenced after repatriation. How do you calculate the compound interest on mercy? The experiment, for that's what it was, an experiment in whether ideological transformation was possible through humane treatment, succeeded beyond its architect's hopes. The re-education program for German prisoners of war in America is now studied as one of history's most effective deployments of soft power. It demonstrated that even deeply indoctrinated adults could change when confronted persistently with evidence contradicting their beliefs. It proved that military defeat doesn't require dehumanization of the defeated, that security doesn't require cruelty, that strength can manifest as generosity, that the most powerful weapon against totalitarian ideology might be the simple evidence of democratic abundance. But the program's success depended on specific conditions that may not be replicable. America, in 1943 through 1946, was uniquely positioned, wealthy enough to treat prisoners well without sacrificing domestic needs, secure enough to risk minimal security measures, confident enough in its system to let prisoners observe it freely. The prisoners, meanwhile, arrived from a nation that had proven its ideology bankrupt through catastrophic defeat. Their psychological readiness for transformation was born from the collapse of everything they'd fought for. Would the same approach work in different circumstances? Historians debate this. What's clear is that 75% of German prisoners left America with gratitude. Gratitude that translated into decades of pro-American influence in West Germany, contributing to its successful democratization and its steady alliance with the West during the Cold War. Heinrich Müller's leg, saved by American surgeons on a battlefield in France, carried him through 54 years of life after the war. He walked with a limp but without bitterness. He built a business, raised a family, and participated in democracy. He voted for leaders who made mistakes but could be replaced. He paid taxes that funded social programs and infrastructure instead of weapons and conquest. He lived to see Germany reunified, to see democracy triumph over communism, to see his grandchildren grow up in peace. He lived to see the alternative that had been impossible to imagine in 1944. A Germany that fed its people, respected their rights, and settled disputes through law instead of force. A Germany integrated into Europe and the Atlantic Alliance. A Germany that remembered its crimes and taught its children to never repeat them. The irony was bitter, but instructive. Germany achieved under defeat, occupation, and democratic reconstruction everything the Nazis had promised through conquest and domination: prosperity, security, respect, influence, everything except the toxic dream of racial supremacy, which turned out to be the only thing National Socialism had actually offered. And Heinrich had learned this in captivity. Eating American food, reading American books, working American farms, and being treated with the dignity his own government had taught him only superior races deserved. 3/4 left, with gratitude, 75%. The weight of that number is staggering when you understand what it means, that kindness deployed systematically can transform even those raised in hatred, that prosperity demonstrated can defeat propaganda about poverty, that dignity extended can crack the architecture of dehumanization. But also this, that the men who left with gratitude carried guilt forever. Gratitude for enemies who treated them well. Guilt for a regime that had treated no one well. The two emotions intertwined, inseparable, shaping every day of the decades that followed. Heinrich carried both until the day he died. And in his journal, on the last page, in handwriting that shook with age and something else, he wrote, "I was saved by those I tried to destroy. I was taught by those I believed inferior. I was fed by those I wanted to starve. And now at the end I understand. The greatest defeat was believing we were superior. The greatest victory was learning we were simply human, like them, like all of us. Always human. That's all. That's everything."